if I say something about myself, I started professional life as a social worker, during which time I also worked in an adolescent counselling agency. I then did a training as a couples therapist at the same time as doing what was then called the BPA training. I then did the slight diversion to the analytic training here. So professionally, that was my journey. But in terms of work, I worked for a long time in an agency that worked with couples. After my social work career, I worked for a long time in an agency that worked with couples. In the last 22 years, I've worked in the NHS in a forensic psychotherapy clinic. So I've always had a mixture of sort of private practice, and I still have a mixture of private practice, and working in institutions. And personally, that's what I've found most sort of satisfying, professionally and personally. When this day today that we're having, it's probably worth spelling out that we're talking about training as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, because as you know, there's many different modalities of activity which are called psychotherapy. We're talking particularly about psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and it is worth spelling that out because there are some political differences between psychoanalytic psychotherapy, but there are some real technical and conceptual differences between psychoanalytic psychotherapy and behavioural or cognitive or arts therapies, all of which have a place in the sort of social care world. But there is a particular place that psychoanalytic trainings have, and that's what we're talking about today. And you've noticed that we've got a child and adolescent psychotherapist amongst us and a young psychotherapist. So those three are what this institution is concerned with. So what do I mean about psychoanalytic or psychoanalysis? Briefly, what I mean by that is you can think of it as a tripartite activity. The first and probably the central is that psychoanalysis gives us a theory of mind. It gives us a theory about how a mind or a person develops. And also, if we're thinking about how a person develops, how one mind develops, it gives us a theory about how that one person may relate to other people, both other people in his or her external world, but also the experiences and the memories that we all have of people that we've met. So the psychoanalysis gives us a way of thinking about how the individual develops and becomes who he or she is, and also about how the individual then manages his or her relationships. And as I say, the important thing for psychoanalysis is that we have external relationships with each other, but we also have very powerful images within ourselves based on our experiences. And that also makes up part of who we are as people. And psychoanalysis psychoanalysis has a conceptual framework for that. The second thing that you could say psychoanalysis is that on the basis of that conceptual model of the development of the mind, it also gives us a technique for intervening with people who are distressed or in trouble. Based on an understanding of how the mind works, it also gives us some understanding of how the mind might not work very well. And on the basis of that, we then develop a technical theory, a theory about how to work clinically with patients. Now, the third thing about psychoanalysis, which we'll talk about less, is that also, because of that conceptual model of the mind, because of that model of how technically we might intervene with people, it also gives us the possibility of researching into different aspects of the personality, differentiations between different types of personalities, between different types of relationships. So the third dimension of psychoanalysis is that it gives us a tool for research. And you might know that increasingly psychoanalysis has tried to develop research as part of its sort of way of being, but it's not very easy. I mean, I'm not a researcher, so I don't know, but it's not very easy because psychoanalysis is based on sort of individual experiences and to some degree group and family. But it's quite difficult to research. But I think increasingly there are attempts to research psychoanalysis. The next thing I want to say is that psychoanalytic psychotherapy, is a serious business. People come to us because they are in serious distress. They may be suicidal, they may be violent, they're certainly often very disturbed personally, they may have difficult relationships, they may find it difficult to sort of settle into work, they may be quite destructive in their behaviour. So people come to us not for light matters. This idea about the hamstered well coming to psychotherapists or psychoanalysts, I mean, I'm sure that happens, but it's actually quite a nonsense. People come to psychotherapists, psychoanalytic psychotherapists, because they are in distress. We, therefore, as clinicians, have a profound responsibility to make sure that we prepare ourselves as well as we possibly can to meet those people in distress. And the way that we do that is by having a very serious, intensive training. The best we can do to prepare ourselves, because we are the primary tools for the patients that come to us, that we prepare ourselves as seriously as we can. And certainly the trainings in the BPF attempt to do that. And the seriousness of the trainings, as I'm calling, is sort of tripartite again. Probably the most important is one's own personal analysis. One's own personal analysis sets one up to be as sensitive as one can be to oneself and to others. And one has to be sensitive to oneself because when we're in the presence of somebody who is distressed, because we're human, we will get distressed. We'll get disturbed. We will get upset. We'll get angry. We'll get excited. So we have to make sure that we have as good a capacity to manage our own emotions when we're dealing with other people's emotions. And obviously, the more difficult the emotions are that other people have, the more likely it is that we will get disturbed. So we have to be very well prepared by having some sort of understanding of our own mental states. That can only be, hopefully, to a large degree, it can only be partial. We can never be completely sort of aware of our own emotional states. But the more we can be aware, the more likely it is that we can then be, as it were, useful to our patients. The other aspect of the training, as you know, is that in the training, we work with patients and then we have very intensive supervision for those patients. So that throughout the training, people have two training patients, or it probably varies a little bit amongst the different trainings, but with very intensive training for 2, 3, 4 years on those patients. And that's the other sort of arm about arming ourselves for being with patients in distress. We learn to apply the techniques and the concepts that we learn about to patients under very heavy supervision. And I do mean heavy because that is the other arm about how we make sure that we are as prepared as we can be for this, what I call a very serious business. The third dimension, I suppose, of how we prepare ourselves is that throughout, and this is probably true of other professions, but throughout our professional life as psychotherapists, psychoanalysts, we continue to have sort of CPD opportunities. We belong to supervision groups, we belong to consultancy groups, we go to seminars, we read, we study. There's always an attempt to sort of keep up with whatever people are developing in terms of their thinking about the work we're doing. A very serious business, and we have to take it seriously. I mean, the paradox is, I think once we've done that very serious basic training, I think like Julian suggested, actually then a number of other avenues become open to us. I mean, even at this table, we are people who have done the basic sort of training, but we work with groups, we work with families, we work with children, we work with adolescents, we work in the NHS, we work in other institutions, we do consultancy. So doing the core training actually provides them with a very solid base from which we can then do other activities. And we all do, many people do, not everybody, many people do. And personally, I find that enriching to have a sort of a range of opportunities that I can practice my analytic thinking in. And the important thing is whether I'm working with a couple or in an institution or when I was a manager of an institution, to think analytically, because some of the sort of core concepts, analytic concepts, are very useful in any setting. For example, unconscious processes happen everywhere. They're happening in this room. Human personalities are dynamic. There's always movement between wanting to be close to somebody, wanting to be distant from somebody, wanting to be open to somebody, wanting to defend oneself against somebody. There's always dynamic processes that go on in any individual and therefore in any group, in any relationship. And if you have an awareness of that, it helps you in those different settings. The transference and the counter-transference, again, whether we like it or not, we all bring with us, including in this room at this moment, hopes and expectations. We all sit in this room with hopes and expectations. We will all react in different ways to the rest of each other. I sit in this room with hope and expectation that you might learn something from the three of us and that you might come and do the training. That's my hope and expectation. You have your hopes. You're sitting in this room thinking you might learn something from the three of us. You probably won't, but so there's always hopes and expectations, and they are part of any human relationship. And the training allows us to sort of think about what they might be. And the other thing, of course, is that particularly with patients, we will be, as I've said before, we will be sort of affected by the way the patients treat us and the way the patients come into the room. Patients come in with their own expectations, their own dreams, their own nightmares, and we will get caught up in that theatre. So we have to be able to manage our own counter-transference. Quite a lot of analytic work, you could say, is done in the counter-transference. We have to be able to process our own emotional experience in relation to our patients, and that gives us some access to what's going on in the patient. They will stir in us aspects of their own internal world. couple of other things before I stop, because I haven't got very long. One of the discussions, you may know, one of the debates that goes around in sort of psychoanalysis, psychotherapy is, what's the difference between a more intensive treatment and a less intensive treatment? And therefore, what's the difference between perhaps a more intensive training and less intensive training? This is partly a political question, and I don't particularly willing to get into that. But I do think it's worth thinking about this, that I think there is a difference between, if you see a patient, the more often you see a patient, the chances are that process, if you're seeing somebody 2, 3, 4 times a week, the fact that you're seeing somebody 3, 4 times a week, there'll be something that happens in the relationship whereby that which we're talking about today, we can carry on talking about tomorrow and then the day after tomorrow. So there's a process that takes place in that more regular contact. In other words, you could say that the analytic process carries the treatment. Now, if you're seeing somebody less than that sort of greater intensity, there's a pressure on you as the clinician to let the patient go at the end of that hour or 50 minutes, knowing you're not going to see them again for a week. There's a pressure to give them something. There's a pressure to have some sort of understanding that you give them. Now, clearly, we hope to have understanding of our patients, but there is a difference between the patient being understood by us, very important that is. The patient does feel that he or she needs to be understood by us. But there's a difference between that and the patient coming to understand themselves. And they might come to understand themselves if they get caught up in the analytic process, whereby just from the experience of being in a relationship with somebody, they learn about themselves. Now, this is not simply a matter of 3 or 4 times a week or once a week. It does contribute to it. I mean, the most important thing is the state of mind or the stance that the clinician takes. But that it is more likely that it's possible to do that being carried by the analytic process in a more intensive treatment than in a less intensive treatment. So there is a difference. So in terms of when you think about what sort of training you want to do, that is worth thinking about and discussing with people here. The last thing I'm going to say, before I can answer some questions, is that I said earlier on that it's a serious business, psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic psychotherapy. All of us have a sane mind, a mature mind, but all of us also have the capacity to have a less sane, a less mature mind. I mean, in the jargon, you could say we have a non-psychotic and a psychotic part to our personality. Now, I don't mean that in the sort of psychiatric sense that we're bonkers. I mean, some of us might be. But I don't mean it in that sense. What I mean is that we're all capable of thinking in ways which are slightly disconnected from reality because of our own wishes, because of our own anxieties, because of our own history. And that you don't need to be working in a forensic clinic or a psychiatric hospital or in any other institution for sometimes our patients to present a part of their personality which is, if you like, a bit more disturbed, a bit disconnected from reality. And actually, I think there's an interesting paradox. I mean, I feel very strongly that if a treatment takes hold and if a treatment is working, it is more likely, because the treatment is working, that the patient will actually bring that more disturbing part of themselves to you because they trust themselves, they trust the process, and they trust you. And therefore, they will be able to bring to the fore that more disturbing part of the personality that they have. So that even in sort of private practice, let alone in institutions, we have to be prepared for the fact that sometimes patients have experiences within themselves and with us which can be quite disturbing, which takes us back to this as a serious business. I'm going to stop there because I could talk on forever.